I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm excited to be talking to Eoin Macken all about his series Borderline. And in starting off, you've mentioned previously how the writing of these scripts really gave you such a strong sense of who Boyd was as a character early on, but also with the framework of the story in terms of Ireland, that growing up in Ireland yourself, obviously in the 80s and 90s, where all of the things explored in the show were much more prevalent and visible, that also kind of helped you to really understand where he sat as a character morally and emotionally in a lot of ways. And I just wanted to ask about the experience of diving into the scripts and finding all of those things so instantaneously.
First of all, I'm just going to let you answer all the questions for me because that was a really great synopsis of how I saw the character. So thank you. Um, that was what drew me to the script and to playing the character because I was really interested by playing a character from that side of the board. It's so interesting because it is only 2 hours from where I live, and my sister and I talk about him a little bit. My sister's boyfriend is from the north, and we're constantly ribbing him all the time every Christmas about the fact he's from the north, despite the fact it's literally 2 hours away. But there are still those kind of ingrained cultural differences because of the reality of the kind of nature and the history of the North and the South. And what was really interesting about this show is that what John Forte I think has done really cleverly is that these are still two people who they're both still cops and they're kind of in the same police forces to an extent. They're still doing the same thing, but they do still have different regulations and rules and ways of dealing with things, and they both have different sort of cultural and social experiences. And that's what I thought was really interesting, how these two characters, the dynamic and the push and the pull, both from a serious and a kind of sort of more light comedy kind of way. I just thought that was fascinating. And I thought I was like, I really wanted to get invested in this world and explore that.
I love that, and obviously it kind of comes at the approach of, here's these two officers working and they're on different sides and they're kind of abrasive with each other. But what I kind of love is that by the end of the season, they're not suddenly best friends, but they do have this kind of bond and relationship with each other. And so as you were looking episode by episode at how their relationship kind of changes, how did you figure out the little milestones or the little moments that you were feeling of, I feel like this would change things between them a little bit, but they can still take a step back for every step forward.
Sure. So you watched the whole show?
Yeah, yeah. I loved
Ah,
it.
good, good. Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, what's really interesting about it is the fact that myself and Amy De Bruyne have actually become really good friends and we get on really well. And I think it's really important sometimes, I think, for the not always, but for the chemistry of these type of shows, I think it's important that you kind of get on. And it was similarly with myself, John, and the director Rob. We all had a nice dynamic. And so because me and Amy had a nice relationship off screen, I feel like we were able to bring a little bit of that into the characters a bit. And we sort of pushed, especially at the start, there was a lot of abrasiveness between them. And we wanted to bring it to make the two of them a bit, make sure you liked these people and also that they also liked each other and respected each other. So we tried to search for some more moments that you could see that the two characters are beginning to sort of understand and care about each other, both professionally and like as people. And I think that was really important. And as they learn about each other, and you learn about Amy's character and her kind of her backstory and they understand each other's backstory. I think they both begin to have a bit more of a duty of care towards each other as people. I think that becomes really important. Was that a black cat I just saw?
Yeah. There's also something about the abrasiveness that they kind of make all these little jabs at each other at the beginning. And at the beginning, they're very true. And that is 100% how they feel towards each other. But as time goes on, they still make these digs at each other, but some of them are actually a very friendly way of communicating. It's that thing. We're two people who aren't going to necessarily show or talk about our emotions, but by making these little jabs feel friendly, that's our own form of communication. And how did you feel like the dialogue and just the tone of that delivery changing also really gave you a lot to play off of?
Well, it's really interesting, right? Because when you're dealing with people who have these professions, they're still dealing with, they're dealing with murder and life and death, and they're dealing with these really important things. They're dealing with issues like important immigration, and these are people's lives they're dealing with. So they're not flippant issues, and at the same time, they're taking these elements home with them all the time. So it's a hard job that they have to deal with. It's a hard job in reality. And I think it was really important to be able to find some of the humor in that and also some of the it's really important that Boyd finds the emotional connection towards the people he's trying to help, which is an important sort of development for him. Because that's the humanity of it. You know, they can't just exist within their own spheres, and they also both have to grow outside of their own boxes, which I think is really important because they both come from, I think the older you get in life, you come from a certain place and you surround yourself with the same ideas and thoughts, and people have similar values. And so for Boyd and Regan to come at it from different points of view, I think that's important because it expands both of their worldviews.
And even just their rhythm with each other, you know, at the beginning, the person taking charge or taking the lead in any given moment is very much set by the parameter of which side of the border they're on. But as they start to get to know each other, they kind of develop this natural rhythm and sense of, you know, it makes sense for you to kind of take the lead here. You know, here's where I'm going to jump in. And they're not necessarily having to have conversations about it the whole time. And so how did you and Amy really want to use the idea of who's leading in any given moment during the investigation or a conversation to really reflect a lot as well?
Sometimes it was whoever just didn't have a hangover at the time. I was like, you know what, your character can just take the lead on this. Is fine. You can just push this scene. Now, it was important. It was important because once you establish that rapport, you know, because once you've gone past that point, then the characters can evolve to the next point. They don't need to be having the same kind of argument all the time. You know, once they start to trust each other, but that also becomes part of what you end up trusting each other as artists on the show, because you start to understand the characters a bit more and you can go, you know what, this is the reality of that is this, but now they would start to trust each other more and they would start to give each other more latitude, and have each other's backs.
And obviously, with your character as well, there's a lot surrounding him with the fact that he lost his dad in a very violent manner when he was a kid and played witness to that. And, you know, he talks at one point about how he thinks about it every single day. He tries to pretend like everything's okay, but it keeps him really, you know, feeling connected and present with his family, even. And so when you look at a detail like that and how he feels about it, how did that shape a lot of scenes, particularly in terms of the home life that we see for him?
Um, yeah, so I mean, I think that's that was a difficult one to try and make sure. I think, I mean, I lost a complicated personal history with father figures, and my dad has died and this, that, and so you kind of end up sort of, I understand, I guess, part of what I feel like Boyd is going through different parts of my own history, but at the same time, it was really important because I think there's a lot of trauma and a lot of kind of um things that have happened on that side of the border that people still live with, and not just in North, but all over the place. You're trying to make sure that that is as real as possible and does affect him as it should, because it has that ripple effect through generations of especially an event like that. And so for Boyd, he really is struggling with not just the death of his father, but also trying to figure out what kind of a man his father was, and then what kind of man that makes him, and then who he should be. And I think that's a really important element of his journey.
It is. And, you know, we see the emotional impact, but we also see how the emotion creates a physical response to it as well. And kind of, you know, we get to see a couple of moments where he's having literal panic attacks and his body is experiencing everything that he's thinking and feeling. When you looked at that in the script, what was your inroad for figuring out how you wanted to play that and approach it?
Uh, that's a really good question. I think at the time it was really important that he couldn't face up to that. So that's why it became a physical reaction, because he wasn't intellectually able to kind of think about it too much, and he buried it so much. So there's that idea that, you know, when you bury something that's painful really deep in your belly, is that when it actually does come up, it actually causes that visceral pain in your gullet. And that's kind of what I wanted him to kind of feel, you know.
And you were mentioning that there's this idea of who was his dad really compared to what he thought he was. You know, he really always looked at his dad as, you know, this legacy officer, you know, who had so much respect from everybody around him. And, you know, he talks about having wanted to make sure that he reached 5'6" because that was how tall you had to be to pass qualifications to enter the force at the time. And so, you know, he's wanted to pursue this ever since he was a kid and follow in his dad's footsteps. And how much did the idea of trying to live up to the idea of the legacy of his father really form him for you as well?
I think it was massive because it's really interesting, right? Because he sort of he venerates his father, and I think that's what people tend to do, especially when someone has died, you know, rightly or wrongly. And so for him, uh there's no part of it for Boyd that he will ever have anything but absolute admiration for his father. So he doesn't see it as being any other possibility. And part of that is because he was so young when his father died. So I think for Boyd to his whole life has been trying to live up to something that he's not really able to live up to because it's so young when he saw his father die. But also for him then to become aware that maybe everything wasn't exactly as it transpired, I think is also what's the most difficult thing, because was his father morally doing the right thing or wrong thing? Who knows? And I think that's a really complicated thing for him that he's going to struggle with, especially going forward as well.
And obviously, things change for him when he learns that the person that he believes, Patrick Gorman, to be responsible for his father's death is nearby, and he has the opportunity to confront him. And this is someone that he has envisioned the idea of taking his life for years at this point. And there's kind of a shift of him wanting to enact violence to, I actually feel like through my connection with my religion that I need to go and just have a conversation with him, and I just need to ask him face to face if he was responsible for this. And within that, I'll know. And I was just interested in kind of your perspective on that real shift and change of the idea that he's had for years suddenly becomes something quite different in how he wants to confront it.
Well, it was really interesting because I think that part of the story that John brought in was great, because suddenly, you know, Boyd, this character, is faced with the reality that the man that he is convinced has killed his father, who he wants to get absolute revenge for, is right there, and he can get that revenge. And it's a really interesting moral dilemma and quandary for him of what he should do. And based off his faith, he should just have a conversation. But when that gets rejected, then that kind of almost internally causes him, a lot of cognitive dissonance of kind of how he believes, his own struggle with his own morality, his idea of faith, and also I think the loyalty he feels towards his father, because he feels like he should get revenge for what's happened to his father. So it's a really difficult scenario, and it does cause a sort of a break internally in Boyd, because this is somebody who's very morally centered and very absolutely correct in kind of his stubborn beliefs and kind of how he acts, and he breaks that. And I think that's something that a lot of people probably would struggle with the idea of doing or not doing. And that's what's really interesting about that moment, especially when the person that he is convinced has killed his father is literally right there. Um,
And with the fact you're bringing up his faith as well, his faith and his religion is such a central core to the character as well. And we see how it impacts who he is as a person. We also see the way that it imparts into the work that he does throughout as well. And what was that like, having that as such a center of the core, and really looking at how his relationship with religion forms so much of who he is as a person throughout the entire show?
it's really important. I mean, it's important in a lot of places, but especially in Ireland, our religion is so heavily embedded in our culture and our identity. And up in the north, it's a bit more complicated, especially as that is a huge part of why the divide has happened with the North and South. And so you kind of Boyd's faith is also driven by his need to justify for himself the fact that his father's died. So that also is kind of what pushes him into an even deeper form of faith, as a way of protecting himself. Um, and so he really struggles with that then, because the idea of revenge, the idea of killing somebody, is so um absolutely opposite to kind of the core tenets of his daily life as going to church. So it is something that kind of really sort of fractures him, even to think about it.
Yeah, and even just the fact that he is an organ player within his church, will go home and play the piano, and kind of that feels like a solitude and an escapism for him from his work as well, in a place that he can just try to emotionally shut himself off, even if he's not always successful at doing it. How were those scenes really helpful just in terms of seeing a different side to him, and what does it look like when he tries to extricate his feelings from the day to day?
Yeah, they're really important and interesting, because I think especially the instrument, the piano itself, and playing the organ, because there's such a beauty in that instrument, but also because there is it's a solitary type of instrument. Playing the piano is a solitary endeavor, and so and if you actually listen, all the songs that he plays are quite sad and quite melancholic. I mean, a lot of Irish history and a lot of the Irish songs are quite sad and melancholic anyway. So we kind of suffer from that all the time. But especially for Boyd, yeah, he's I think he hasn't fully got over the mourning of that situation.
And there's also this other aspect to his personality, that Regan very much obviously picks up on and kind of gives him little jabs or mocks him about, where, sometimes as he's working through a case, he likes to just pull himself away and kind of find space by himself. And, he's notorious amongst his colleagues for talking to himself as well, and has a nickname because of that. And what was that like, looking at that side of how he tries to process the work that he's doing and work through everything?
Well, he's also probably the kind of character that a lot of people will kind of take jabs at, because he is so straight-laced. So, I think he opens himself up to be mocked a little bit, because but that's also what Regan does. That kind of Regan breaks him out of his own shallow way. Regan doesn't follow any rules, and is a bit more abrasive, and Boyd is more structured and polite. And so I think he brings more of that into her life, and she kind of breaks him out from his own, give him a bit more spontaneity, you know, and sort of breaks him out from that kind of structured identity that he kind of has built around himself, which I would probably take the piss out of him for as well.
I mean, and part of that structured identity feels very prevalent in his costumes, and the fact that he's very formally dressed sometimes. Sometimes he's just wearing a
Too
button-up.
well dressed. He's always so well dressed. There's never a button out of place with this guy.
How did the costumes kind of help with that idea of a really structured identity?
It's really interesting. I never really understand a character until you're actually wearing the costume. It really is one of those things that once you get the costume right, then the character feels, because really how you dress. I mean, I never thought about this in my own life before I start acting as a character, and then you go, oh my God, is that how I dress in real life? And then do people think of me in that way? Because how a character dresses is so synonymous and so important towards grounding them. And so how Boy dresses is very specific. And even the types of fabrics and stuff are very specific in the tweeds. He's not flashy, but he's really well dressed and well groomed. He dresses odd, shall we say, but very formally.
And even with what he wears, it feels like that kind of carries over into the physical component of the role, because if he is on foot on pursuit of someone for questioning, or person of interest, he's not going to be quite as adept running in a three-piece suit as Regan is, and just kind of like jeans and a tank top and a leather jacket. And it kind of feels a little bit like he sees her strength in that area and kind of lets her take the lead as well. And how did the costumes kind of carry over to that side for you?
You'd be surprised how flexible that tweet is. You know, you can do some stuff. Yeah, I think he becomes envious of the fact that Regan is actually dressed for the job, and he is probably sometimes a little bit overdressed and not really dressed. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, yeah, the running and doing chasing stuff in a three piece tweed suit, I would not recommend.
And you kind of see these little inflections of moments where he starts to kind of see certain things that she's doing, and kind of has admiration and respect, and kind of sees how good at her job she really is. And in one of the early episodes, she goes in pursuit of someone and literally dives into the water swimming after them, to apprehend them so that they don't get across the border in any way, shape, or form. And for you, what were kind of the important beats that you really found of where the admiration and the respect of the work really started to come into play?
I think it's moments like that, because Regan was so willing to try to throw herself literally into the ocean, or throw herself in the job. She would sort of think about her own safety secondary, as kind of doing what she thought was right. And I think Boyd has a little bit of less that spontaneity, and he is a bit more kind of careful and structured about how he deals with everything. And Regan is more gung ho. I think that's when Boyd really respects that and also kind of wants it. And at the same time, going back to what you're talking about, you know, about facing up to the understanding Gorman and the fact that he might get revenge on Gorman. Part of that, I also, me and Amy discussed the fact that Regan also sort of inadvertently allows that side of him to come out a bit more, because he becomes aware of her sort of less formalized nature of dealing with both life and the job. And I think that sort of pushes him towards a bit more chaos theory, even in his own mind.
And there's
So
also the
I'm actually blaming Regan here instead of blaming Amy. That's
There's also the aspect of everything that she's dealing with, and the fact that, she does reveal to him, there's someone that I helped put away, and they really want to come after me, and that's why I'm here, and this isn't even my real name. And, he kind of talks about building this closeness and this trust with someone that he doesn't even know her real name at the end of the day. And I think it's really lovely that he never pushes her to reveal that, because he knows what that would mean for her and that it could be a risk. And I was just interested in kind of like your thoughts on how, even though she doesn't tell him all the details, the fact that she opens up is clearly such a meaningful thing between the two of them.
Yeah, I think he's a lot of he ends up having a huge amount of respect for Regan, which he doesn't initially. And that's partly because, as I say, when Regan does offer up anything emotional, he realizes how important that is for her. And I think it's those little moments, like these are two characters who don't just, automatically just become best buddies. Um, it takes them a long time, and even by then, these are still two characters who are still quite they're still quite lonely, I think, because of the job that they have to do, and so he understands how difficult it is for her to connect at all, and so he tries to respect her space in that way. And that's why I think those little moments. That's what I think is great about these two characters, because it comes out these small moments, um, and that's what sort of evolves the characters. It's not something big and grandiose and everything's fine. They're still very, very tentatively learning about each other.
Yeah, and they can kind of experience big things alongside each other, but they don't necessarily have to have these giant, deep conversations with each other to kind of understand it. And one of those moments felt like the fact that for Boyd, that he has struggled with alcoholism and he's been sober for several years, and then we see him reach a breaking point, dealing with everything from the fallout of his dad and that loss and everything he's confronting, where he buys liquor in the store, and Regan sees him right after that, and is kind of there for him, but doesn't need to get deep or try to draw a lot out of him. And what was important to both of you in how that interaction played out?
So it was important because that is sort of one of those moments where she begins to understand him, and even though he hasn't really told her about it's one of those, they like, where she shares a piece. She learns about him, but just enough to sort of give her a greater understanding, and also he gets an understanding about himself too. So it's these little moments that I think are important for sort of understanding where they, as you say, they don't need to have these big important chats where they tell each other everything. It's about they're actually both observing and finding these little things, and then they move on. They see these little things about each other, and it just changes the temperature of the relationship. But then they still have to kind of carry on with what they're doing, because they are on a case and doing a job, and they are doing this reluctantly. They just begin to respect each other more, and they don't, neither, these are not two people who need to kind of dwell on it. They go, okay, cool, I understand you now. I understand you got this pain. I'll respect that, and then we move on.
Yeah. And in talking about episode 6, there's the moment where he finds out that the idea of who his father was is completely opposite to some of the reality. And, it wasn't all of this adulation celebration. And I wanted to ask about the impact that you kind of felt like that really had on him, because it's such a monumental thing, having carried this idea of legacy since he was a kid, and everything that he thought he knew to be true suddenly crumbles in front of him.
I think that's gonna be really interesting for season two. I think that's a big part of what that's going to be, because I think there's a lot of scope for where that's going to be explored, because it is a huge fracture in his identity, and kind of how he sees both himself and the legacy of his father and his own relationship with his son, and also how he sees himself as a, as a BCI moving forward, because it is quite a big event that's happened, and it's quite a lot for him to process. And he already has been, an alcoholic and struggling with stuff. So where he's going to go next, I'm really interested by, because I think he's going to struggle.
Yeah, and you were talking about the connection to the music that he plays, and there's that scene at the end of episode 6 where, the way that he processes everything that he's just discovered and learned and gone through is to just sit down at the piano and kind of quietly play to himself. And it's very different to all of the other moments. And, for your thoughts in playing that, where did you really find him at in that moment?
Oh gosh. That is a complicated one. That was a very difficult, conflicting sort of place to be. And I still don't know if Boyd himself understands where he was in that moment. I think that's part of it, is that he's just trying to there is a release for what's happened, and there is a relief at the same time, because he has figured out the sort of story, as it were, and kind of what's happened to his father. But at the same time, I think there's a sadness to that, because it's not exactly like it's been entirely cathartic, you know.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. And really, really loved your performance throughout the first season, and love that you already mentioned the idea of season two. So can't wait to see that, if that all comes together. And congratulations on all of this. And thank you so much, Owen.
Oh, excellent! Thank you for some really wonderful questions. That was very insightful. That's those are really interesting questions that you put forward. So thank you for that.